Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. On July the 1st, 1945, tragedy struck near the Soldier Creek community in Marshall County. A 4-engine B-29 bomber with a 10-man crew crashed in a thunderstorm. Only one man survived. The story was all but forgotten, except among local folks, and some good citizens over Marshall County have decided that this bomber crew should be memorialized. So in September, a monument will be erected to their memory at the Soldier Creek Church. With me to talk about that is Marshall County historian Gary Teckenbrock, who lives near the Soldier Creek Church. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Again, as we were talking before the program, it's one of those things where the locals remember, but it's forgotten. And this crash made big headlines. I mean, this is a major event. This is a big plane.
It was. It was a devastating thing for the locals to see this happen and see the bodies. You know, there was a war going on for 4 years prior to that, but they were pretty much separated from the war until that day.
Fellows went overseas, and of course planes crashed all over Europe and the Pacific, but for this to come home to the middle of the country.
Yeah.
Walk us through the ill-fated flight. July the 1st, 1945, these 10 men board this bomber on a training mission at an air base near Albuquerque.
Kirkland Field, yes.
And then what happens?
Well, it actually took off June the 30th, about 4 p.m. in the afternoon. They had a pre-flight. They were told to expect storms in the southern states. They were given the altitudes that they were to fly from one point to the other. They left Kirkland Field, like I said, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They flew over Texas. They flew over Mobile, Alabama, turned north. I feel like they simulated a bombing run over the city of Nashville, and then from there they were to fly over an Air Force base in Trinidad, Colorado, and then back to Kirkland.
That would have been a really long flight.
Yes, it would have. But the B-29s, they were known for that.
They could do that.
Yes.
So the plane then is approaching Marshall County from the south, and it's night, and there are really severe thunderstorms.
From all the accounts that I hear, it was just a very terrible storm. Some of the witnesses, the locals, talked about how bad it was. High winds, heavy rain, lightning. You know, it's just your typical 4th of July weekend storm. I think we've all been through one of those.
Sure. So then what happens to the plane? Is it's approaching the neighborhood of Soldier Creek, thunder, lightning, wind, heavy rain. What happens to this plane?
Well, all we know is from the survivor's account, Mr. Elias, Irvin A. Elias.
And we have a photo of him. We could show that. He's the one lucky fellow aboard this plane. And here he is in a very typical World War II era flight suit. He's actually standing before a B-24 bomber here. So, continue, please.
All we know is what he told in his accident report, which I have a copy of. And apparently, about the time they entered Kentucky, they ran into the storm. They'd flown through storms before, so it really wasn't an issue to them. They weren't too worried. He was a left wing gunner, and on a training mission it was his job to look out the blister on the B-29 to watch the 3 and 4 engines for smoke or oil leaks or whatever. That was his job. And he went back to the rear of the plane. About the time he got back there, it started rocking and had a lot of turbulence, and the plane was just really out of control. The lights went out, and the next thing he knew, it just opened up. And
the plane broke up in midair.
The plane broke just a few feet above those blisters that I referred to earlier.
And they're on the side of the plane where the gunners could look out, and because the guns on the B-29 were fired by remote control, so these blisters were very important.
Exactly.
So the plane breaks up, and Elias finds himself in space.
That's basically his story. I mean, he really don't remember a lot about what happened other than feeling the tug of the chute. He said he didn't even remember pulling the cord. he said seconds after he felt the chute tug, he hit the ground. So he was one lucky individual.
Did people in the area hear the plane crash, hear it fall?
A lot of people did. My grandparents lived like a quarter of a mile from where it went down. My dad was in the South Pacific at the time, so my mother and my older sister were living with my grandparents. I grew up hearing about this night, hearing this story, and they heard it crash. There was a definite, even over the storm, they knew there was something that happened. I remember my grandmother, I can still close my eyes and see her saying, "We thought the Germans were bumming us."
Sure.
So they knew there was something going on. Some other people, they really didn't know if it was something happened or not because of the noise from the storm.
Right, right. Now, Elias, again, if I can remember from the story, he landed and then spent the night in the darkness, not really knowing where he was.
Exactly. He had no idea what happened to the plane, the rest of the crew. I think he had a head injury, maybe a little bleeding, so he tore some of his chute, made himself a bandage, and wrapped up in the chute and tried to wait out the dark and the storm.
So then the sun came up, and then he went to the house went to a nearby house, and that was Mrs.
Bohannon,
who is still living.
Still living.
And her first name is?
Maxine.
Maxine Bohannon, right. So he knocks on the door, and then what happened?
Well, just like any other West Kentuckian or Marshall Countyan, you hear a door knock, you just say, "Come on in," and he wasn't used to that, and so he knocked again.
Where was he from, by the way, Elias?
He was from Brooklyn, New York.
Okay.
And that makes an interesting story in itself, the fact that he was from Brooklyn and they were from West Kentucky.
Got a language barrier
They
here.
couldn't understand each other. And also, something that kind of threw him a curve, Mr. Bohannon had just bought a car, and it had Ohio license plates on it. When he walked up and saw the car in the driveway, he thought he was in Ohio. So he was really confused.
Wow.
Yeah.
I bet he was. So she spoke to him, brought him in, and then didn't Mr. Bohannon take him to Mayfield to the doctor?
Took him to Mayfield to the hospital there, Fuller Gillum Hospital.
There was a Fuller Gillum Hospital, sure
I'm
was.
assuming that's probably the hospital.
Yeah, that was one of the hospitals in town. Well, now, meanwhile, it's daylight, and people are coming out and seeing this horrible wreckage and these bodies. I mean, do you have any accounts of local people coming upon the wreckage and seeing it and what they thought?
I've talked to several eyewitnesses. Of course, these eyewitnesses they were young.
Yeah.
This happened 63 years ago, so a 10-year-old would be 73 years old
Exactly.
now. So most of the adults have already gone on. So, but I've talked to several witnesses, and some of them had nightmares for months after seeing what they saw. It was just a terrible, terrible thing for people to see. They'd been a war going on all this time, and they'd been kind of sheltered
Sure,
from
they
that
would have been, absolutely.
until this night.
Right.
And it kind of brought home some of the horrors of war.
Oh, I'm sure it did.
It did.
I'm sure it did. Now, I assume that the Army Air Force brought investigators in pretty quickly and cordoned the area off.
Exactly.
Removed the bodies, and the wreckage was hauled away, I guess, most of it?
From what I understand, there's a couple of pictures in there that the Berryhill family sent me where they're dragging a motor and a prop or part of a motor.
Now, Berryhill was another crewman?
He was a corporal from Mississippi.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, he was the youngest one on the ship. He was 19 years old.
Yeah. Yeah.
He got 5 brothers. There were 6 Berryhill boys, and all 5 of them the other 5 are still alive and coming to the memorial service.
Right. So then, it's just basically forgotten except by local people. It did make big headlines. I mean, I've seen newspaper accounts of it, and this was big news. A plane this big crashed and killing 9 men with it. And we talked earlier about a former student of mine, Pete Howell, who actually told me about the story. He had done some metal detecting and had found relics of this plane out there many, many years later. And so then what made you got together with Josh Tubbs, another student of mine.
Mm-hmm.
And now what is his position with the county government over there?
He's a county planner.
He's the county planner.
Mm-hmm.
And you all decided to put up a memorial to these fellows. Now, how easy was it contacting these folks?
Some of them were relatively easy. Some of the men that had brothers wasn't really, you know, if you've got a last name and you've got a hometown, wasn't that bad. The ones that only had sisters or daughters, it was really frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
I was beginning to give up on a couple of them, but we contacted family members of all the 9 men that died. We've got pictures of all of them, letters. It's been a great experience.
But ironically, the one family you've had no luck with is the family of the survivor.
That's right. I don't know if he had issues after this. I can only imagine living through something like this and
wondering why you were the one who made it and all your buddies didn't.
Right. I don't know if it was something that he had problems with. He might not even told his family about it. I don't know. I've made several phone calls to where I think his family live, and as soon as I mention his name and what I'm doing, they hang up the phone for whatever reason.
Well, I'm sure that the family members were very appreciative of what you all are doing.
Oh,
and,
it's been amazing.
Yeah.
We've had some touching phone calls.
I'm sure you have.
When Mr. Kazan, he was a sergeant on the plane, and he had a daughter that was 4 months old. Of course, his wife remarried after he died, and so I had to find out who his wife remarried to. Of course, he adopted her, had to find out her name. Then once she got married, I had to find out her name. Now, it was quite a process to track her down, but when I did, and I got to telling her what I was doing, it was a very special moment.
And of course, we talked earlier, without the internet, this would have been extremely difficult, if not impossible.
Yeah, I've had several people ask me, so why you wait so long to do this, you know? Well, one thing, if we'd tried to do it 20 years ago, there's no way.
You'd had very difficult time accomplishing that. So tell us about the ceremony that you're going to be having.
Well, Sunday, September the 7th at 2 o'clock, right there at Soldier Creek Church yard, we're going to erect a monument in honor of these men. Marshall County Physical Court is paying for this. When I talked to Judge Miller about it, I told him
Mike Miller.
Judge Mike Miller. I asked him if he thought the court would be interested, and he said not only interested, he said it's something we should do. And so we're really looking forward to it. We've got about 26 family members right now coming to the service, representing 5 of the men that died in the plane. So we're really excited.
Oh gosh, yeah. And again, it's an amazing story that it was all but forgotten. Now, of these fellows, as far as you all can tell, only one had been in combat before.
Delmer Lundberg. From what I understand, he flew in a B-24 crew out of North Africa, bombing runs over Sicily and Italy, and just kind of worked his way up. Matter of fact, he flew 49 missions before he came back to the States, and then he got put on this crew.
Yeah. You have some rather interesting relics that belong to him. Tell us about that.
Look, Delmer is one of the men that's got a brother that's still living, Don Lundberg. Don lives in Oregon. And when I contacted him, he was just a pleasure to talk to, and he was so excited about us doing this. And I asked Don, you know, if he could send me some pictures or some copies of anything. So he sends me original pictures, and he also sends me an original notebook that his brother Delmer kept while he was overseas. And he's got 49 pages of every mission that he flew. Kind of tells a little bit about what the date, the target, really interesting.
And why is this ragged around the edge?
Don told me that after he and his wife retired, they did a lot of traveling in the Northwest. He had a motor home, and they were driving down the road, and it caught on fire one night. And by the time he ran around back and got the the car that he was pulling unhooked and everything and opened the door. He said it was just in flames. And he said, Gary, he said, you're not going to believe this, but he said everything in that camper burned except for that notebook. And he told me, he said, I always wondered why it didn't burn. He said, tonight I know. He said, I've been waiting on you to call me. And he said, I want you to have it. So he shared that with us, and he also sent wings off Delmer's uniform. He sent me a clip out of a German Luger that from I think it was a German captain that he had captured there in North Africa. Mm-hmm. So, you know, he's 81 years old. He said, I don't know what's going to happen to all this stuff when I die. And he said, I want somebody to have it that thinks as much of Delmer as I do. And he said, I think you're the one. Mm-hmm.
What are some of the other stories about the family members that you can remember talking to? And again, I'm sure they were all very grateful what you did. But
they were. Joseph Barone, he was from Boston, Massachusetts. He was in his second year in Boston College when he quit and joined the Army Air Corps. His parents were born in Italy. I think they came to the United States around the turn of the century. He had 9 kids, 4 boys, and all 4 were in World War II. Mm-hmm. James Schetzel, he was from Lorraine. No, he's from Wabash, Indiana, and he's got 2 brothers still living, and they're coming to the service. His body was brought back on the Wabash Cannonball. I thought that was pretty amazing. Mm-hmm. The pilot, Ward Copenhaver, he had a 4-year-old son. As far as I know, only two of the men were married and had children. It's just been a great experience.
You know, and it's such a microcosm of losses in war.
Right.
There were thousands of men who were lost, left loved ones behind. Mm-hmm. Women too. I mean, this is just, and I think you really put it well by pointing out that this really made the war come home to this small community in western Kentucky. And I'm sure there were a lot of men from that area who were in service, but they were way away in the Pacific or way away in, of course the war in Europe was over by July the 1st of 45, but still there was a lot of fighting going on in the Pacific. It really hit it home. So I guess you feel like you sort of gotten to know these men.
Going into it, when I finally contact a family member, you know, you never know how somebody's going to react. And
who was the first one you contacted? Do you remember?
Barry Hill.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. That was quite a surprise because I thought Barry Hill would be kind of an uncommon name, but apparently in Mississippi there are a lot of Barry Hills.
There's some Barry Hills over in Hickman County, Kentucky.
Really?
Too. Yeah, sure are.
Well, I contacted one in Tupelo, which Plantersville, where Roy was from, is right outside Tupelo. And I contacted a Mr. Barry Hill in Tupelo, and he said, no, I don't know anything about it, but he said, I know some more Barry Hills. I'll see if I can get in touch with them for you. So I got a phone call one day, and on the other end of the line, the guy says, this is David Berryhill. And that was exciting, you know, to make that first contact.
And that was the brother?
That was the brother, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So what did he say?
He just said, I heard you're wanting to know something about my brother Roy. And I said, yes, sir, I really am.
Well, did he know much about the crash, much about where it was or the circumstances?
He knew quite a bit. Like I said, there were 6 boys all together, and all 5 of them are still alive. And I think he may have been one of the older ones. Roy was the oldest of the family, but he knew quite a bit, and he'd heard from his parents. You know, they talked about it. So. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm assuming that the bodies were taken back to their hometowns and buried.
Right.
Yeah.
They took the bodies back to Fort Campbell, which was Camp Campbell back then.
Exactly.
And from there, they went to their respective homes.
By train, I guess, or?
I would assume.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. So, and I guess what's interesting about doing research is you just call up the first Barry Hill, and then that leads to another. And so I guess that's how this process went. You'd call up one person, then that would lead to another person, and so on.
Well, that was probably the only scenario where that happened. You know, I kind of thought that Barry Hill would be the easiest to find because of a rural community in the South. You know, everybody knows everybody. You know, we had a guy from Brooklyn, New York.
Yeah.
We had a guy from Boston, Massachusetts.
Yeah.
We had a guy from Los Angeles, California, San Diego, California.
Big cities.
Yeah,
Right.
and they were tough. They were
Yeah.
tough.
So how did you find the guys who were in the big cities?
Oh, Ancestry.com. Sometimes.
Really?
Yeah. Well, what we did, we just kind of went back in time and tried to find out these guys' parents, grandparents, and just a lot of times we had to go a long way around the barn to find them. But like I said, some of them had sisters, and that was it. And Mr. Graham, he was the co-pilot on the plane. I knew he had a sister, and I looked and searched, tried to find some marriage records for her so I could get a last name to go with her. I finally found her, and she died about 3 months before I found her. And I got to talk to her daughter, and she was gracious enough to send me some pictures and whatnot. But I thought, you know, how sad that we didn't get this done before, before her sister or for her brother.
Well, all the photos you have, are they going to be on display at this service?
Yes. Photos, letters. We got letters from some of the locals that wrote the families, you know, sending their condolences.
Oh, they did?
Yeah. It's pretty touching letters there.
I'll bet.
We've even got Arnold Rushton. He was a sergeant. He was from Iowa. And we've got a copy of the Western Union Telegram telling of his death. I thought that was pretty
That's
amazing.
what all parents dreaded during that period.
You know, I've always heard about them, and you saw them in the movies.
Oh, yeah.
But
to see one.
is pretty amazing.
Yeah. And again, you think of guys being killed overseas in combat, but accidents happened.
Sure.
Training accidents like this happened, and they were guys killed in accidents. A fellow I remember, he was from Kevel, and he was a truck driver. Well, he was killed in a truck accident in Europe. He wasn't killed by the Germans. He was killed in an accident. So these things do happen. Yeah. Training accidents happen like that.
They didn't die in a glorious battle. They didn't die saving a friend, but they died serving our country.
They did.
And that's what's important.
Absolutely. Well, going back to the crash report, did it go into detail as to why this plane didn't survive this storm when it survived other storms?
No, it really didn't. The one amazing thing about the crash was there was no fire. There was no fire in the air. Once it crashed, there was no fire. Some of the witnesses spoke of the strong smell of gasoline all over there. I mean, these things had some big tanks on them.
Enormous fuel tanks in the wings, yeah.
But
no fire.
No fire. They felt like maybe they weren't flying quite the altitude that they should have been. They didn't point any fingers or blame anybody because there was no action could be taken anyway.
Right.
But that it was just basically because of the storm.
Well, from what little I know of thunderstorms, I do know in talking to pilot friends, if you see one you can avoid it, you should, because of the violent winds inside these things. And I suppose it could shake a plane hard enough to where it would just break apart.
Apparently that's what happened. Mr. Elias, in his letter, I got a letter to the Berry Hills from Mr. Elias too, which is some really good reading.
I'll bet.
But he said, you know, we flew through storms time and time again, and really didn't think anything about it. But apparently this one was pretty severe.
Yeah. And I'm sure when they approached this storm, they thought, well, it's just another storm. But at night like that too. And I hadn't heard the part about the Ohio license plates.
Yeah.
I'm sure the fellow was just totally, because it would have been, and you know, you think back in those days, a lot of rural areas were not electrified. And you know, you're bailing out into this abyss.
Exactly.
You don't know whether it's a lake or a river down there or woods or what. And again, going back from what I read, he just sort of waited under a bush or something until sunup. And you can just imagine what's going through his mind. What happened to my buddies? What happened to this plane? Well, now, how far was the bulk of the wreckage from where Elias wound up? Do you know?
Well, that's a good question because we don't really know where Elias landed.
And he probably couldn't have told you either.
No. I've got my theories, and if my theories are correct, just if you know where the Bohannon home was and you know where the crash site was, you kind of put two and two together and try to figure it out. I don't feel like where he landed was probably, it had to be less than a mile, probably closer to 3/4 of a mile. That's my theory.
And you said wreckage was found as far away as Kirksey,
That's what I've heard.
which is, of course, over in Callaway County. Yeah. Well, now, for those who would like, this service open to the public?
Of
Uh,
course.
Give us some directions for those who don't know where Soldier Creek Church is.
If you take Highway 58 out of Benton towards the Brewers area, it's about 7 miles. There'll be signs. We're going to make it pretty easy to find.
And from Benton, that would be a right-hand turn.
It'd be a right.
Sorry, left-hand turn from Benton?
It would be a right there at the Court Square on 58.
Yeah, and as you come down 58, then as you approach the Soldier Creek area, you would turn left.
Exactly.
And how far is the church from the road?
3/4 of a mile.
Okay. That's well, again, it's an absolutely incredible story and you all deserve lots of credit for doing all this on your own, volunteers. Let's name names. Who else helped in this process? You and, of course, Josh Tubbs and
My son-in-law.
his name is
Ryan Dunkelberger.
Okay.
He's a computer whiz.
Got to have those.
Yeah, and when we first started this process, he just jumped into it feet first, and he found a lot of information for us.
Was there much online you could find about the crash itself?
Matter of fact, the only thing I found online was your article. That was it.
Yeah. And I found it, as I said, Pete Halley, we just happened to be talking after class one day, and this topic came up, and I did a classic Graves County, do what? And he said, there was this B-29 crash. And I said, you're kidding. He said, no. And he brought me a little baggie of the relics, and we talked about this before. One of the relics he found was a pitot tube, an airspeed indicator. And he took that thing, I believe he told me, they went to Washington to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, and they have a B-29 there, and he could see it.
Enola Gay.
Exactly. And in fact, I believe this thing even had the maker's name on it.
Right.
If you look close,
I think it was GE.
it might have been.
I think it was.
And I mean, it was just an amazing story. And as I said, I did some research on it and found a copy of the Benton paper, and I'm quite sure it would have been in the Courier Journal. I'm quite sure the Associated Press would have run that all over. And I'm sure back at the base, their home base, did you find much connection about that?
The government's been absolutely no help whatsoever in this project. They did send us the accident report. I called the head historian at Kirkman Air Force Base. Never heard of it. Don't have anything on it.
Nothing.
And as you said earlier, I mean, planes crashing during World War II, that was nothing unusual. But
something else that's not unusual, we're out of time. We always run out of time too fast. That happens all the time. Thank you very much for being with us. My guest today was Gary Teckenbrock. I'm Barry Craig. We'll join you next time.